Hello, and thanks for joining us here at CBR. We've come a long way since the early days of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The MCU is currently at the tail end of Phase 5, with Thunderbolts and Captain America Brave New World due in theaters soon enough. Phase 6 will introduce the Fantastic Four, Blade, and eventually, Robert Downey Jr.'s Doctor Doom. But 16 years ago, no one would have predicted the franchise's ongoing success. Let's look at the origins of the MCU. Marvel didn't always make their own films. Instead, the company would license its characters to studios, taking on the role as co-producer. Movies like Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy, the Blade trilogy starring Wesley Snipes, the many X-Men films, and of course, the 1994 unreleased though still heavily pirated Fantastic Four film were all projects that were not produced in-house. At some point, it became apparent that quality control over these iconic comic book characters was not possible. And from a monetary standpoint, there was no reason that Marvel shouldn't retain its own roster's bankability. Without a unified vision across releases and little crossover potential, Marvel Entertainment head Avi Arad had the idea to start Marvel Studios. However, shortly thereafter, Arad resigned from his position, leaving his second-in-command, Kevin Feige, to become studio chief. After securing an exorbitant loan, Marvel productions were underway, guided by Feige's plan to create a cohesive cinematic universe that would allow for characters to ultimately cross over in mega blockbusters just like their comic event counterparts. Crucial to Marvel Studios' lore preservation, a committee was formed, including Feige and fan-favorite author Brian Michael Bendis. Together, the committee would ensure stylistic continuity and narrative control, which previous outside studio collaborations did not offer. Thus, the Marvel Cinematic Universe was envisioned, but any plan on paper is ultimately pointless without putting it into action. Phase 1 was a make-or-break moment for Marvel Studios. First, they had to roll out films that highlighted individual characters, who would have to connect with audiences enough so that the ultimate crossover goal would have any power. Of course, Marvel fans, those who have pored over countless comic books over the years, would, at the very least, see any project out of curiosity, but to become a major box office success would require a lot of star power and solid execution. Since the early 90s, there had been plans to develop an Iron Man movie. In 1990, Universal bought the rights to the Iron Man character, which were later acquired by Fox and then New Line Cinema. After several failed starts and stops, along with several writers completing various drafts and multiple directors and actors eyed for key positions, the rights ultimately reverted back to Marvel. In 2005, Marvel began work on the film that would become 2008's Iron Man. Several actors were considered for the role of Tony Stark, the role which would eventually go to Robert Downey Jr. But it wasn't all a walk in the park. Back in 2006, Robert Downey Jr. was more publicly well known for his personal life than any then recent roles. Director Jon Favreau's decision to cast Downey Jr. in a role of this magnitude, on a production of this scale, was met with naysayers at every corner, but Favreau's steadfastness ultimately won out in the end. With various drafts, refinements, and tweaks all along the way, Iron Man eventually came out in 2008. Instantly, Robert Downey Jr. was hailed for his charismatic portrayal of a character who begins as a warmongering suit and becomes a victim of his own weaponry. The egotistical Tony Stark becoming a believer of peace while retaining his showmanship is undoubtedly the first peak of Marvel filmmaking, but possibly still the greatest character introduction in the studio's nearly 2 decades history. Iron Man was a major box office success and proved that something was working in Marvel's committee-based formula. But despite a one-off success, the goal was not to be a one-and-done studio, but to maintain a consistent output of high-quality comic book films that would ultimately connect in multiple ways. The next film that Marvel released, however, was not the follow-up they'd been hoping for. In 2003, Ang Lee directed Hulk, starring Eric Bana as Bruce Banner. Co-produced by Universal Pictures, the film was poorly received and ultimately rights reverted back to Marvel. For their 2008 reinvention of the character in The Incredible Hulk, Marvel Studios enlisted director Louis Leterrier and cast Edward Norton as Bruce Banner. The Incredible Hulk was by no means a box office failure. On the critical end, there were many who enjoyed it as a summer blockbuster, but even more who were simply unwowed by the events on screen. With Iron Man's major critical and commercial success, it was likely that anything else to follow in the immediate wake of its release would suffer for comparisons. The Incredible Hulk marked the first and last time that Edward Norton would play Bruce Banner, with subsequent appearances in the MCU handled by Mark Ruffalo. With 2 films under its belt, one an instant win and the other a mild misstep, Marvel Studios was already moving full steam ahead on other projects that would introduce characters who would ultimately become the Avengers. However, it would be another 2 years before anything else hit the big screen. Iron Man 2, the 3rd film of the MCU, came out in 2010 and would be the sole Marvel release that year. The film is, to say the least, not nearly as good as the first film, where 2008's Iron Man was solely about introducing its lead character and positioning him as a publicly known defender of good. Iron Man 2 has too many characters, a denser plot, and loses a lot of its charm. Still, Robert Downey Jr. is great, even if the rest of the film seems ill-considered. Thor was never going to be an easy sell, but his first cinematic appearance is clunky and forgettable. What could have ostensibly been an intriguing fish-out-of-water story is made all the more awkward for Thor being immovably stubborn. Exactly how one would imagine a Norse god suddenly thrown into contemporary society. Despite a relatively bland villain and little chemistry between Thor and his love interest, Chris Hemsworth's portrayal of Thor was good, but needed more time to grow as a character. Thankfully, Avengers was well on its way and would highlight some of the most crucial aspects of the God of Thunder. Despite waning interest, thanks in part to a slow rollout, Marvel moved ahead with 2 films in 2011, Captain America, The First Avenger, and Thor, the latter of which is directed by Kenneth Branagh. Of the 2, Captain America was compared favorably to the pulp adventures of yesteryear and characters like Indiana Jones. Chris Evans, who had previously portrayed Johnny Storm, aka the Human Torch, in Fantastic Four movies outside of Marvel's control, was a perfectly casted hero who could convincingly be the uncomplicated hero at the film's center. Along with the introduction of Steve Rogers, Captain America: The First Avenger also added to Marvel Studios' future by going back into the past. Also introduced are Bucky Barnes, Peggy Carter, and the villainous Red Skull, all of whom would appear in later installments. Marvel was back on track in the lead-up to The First Avengers. In 2012, The Avengers was released. Written and directed by Joss Whedon, the film marks the first time multiple Marvel heroes would be in one room. What results is something that none of the individual films provided until this point, which is an opportunity to highlight character traits through their interactions with one another. Several foundational elements were introduced that would figure larger into the rest of the Infinity Saga. Thanks for joining us today at CBR. Let us know your favorite Marvel Phase 1 movies in the comments below. Remember to hit subscribe before you go, and we'll see you again soon.